Hello everyone, my name is Roseanne Bachagarza and I am a lecturer in the anthropology department at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, Texas. I also managed a community historical archaeology project with schools program, otherwise known as the CHAPS program, here at UTRGV. The CHAPS program mantra is to preserve regional history for future generations to enjoy and ultimately create a cultural heritage corridor in the region. Today, we will take a look back at the history of two 19th century biracial riverside ranches that played a role in assisting runaway slaves across the Rio Grande to freedom in Mexico. In the 1850s, there were two biracial families that settled along the northern banks of the Rio Grande just after it was established as the natural and international border between the United States and Mexico in 1848. The Webbers of Travis County, Texas, and the Jacksons of Wilcox County, Alabama, were two such families. Both families consisted of a white man and his emancipated African-American wife and their mixed-race children, grandchildren, and extended families. Both families purchased thousands of acres of land upon arrival here in Hidalgo County, Texas. Both families had licensed ferry landings on their properties, and both families played a role in assisting runaway slaves to freedom across the Rio Grande and into Mexico. Here we are at what is left of the Jackson Ranch community, south of Military Highway and the levee at the border of San Juan and Pharr, Texas. The Jackson family embarked on their 1,000-mile journey to this location in 5 covered wagons led by family patriarch Nathaniel Jackson, a white Alabama plantation owner, and Matilda Hicks, an emancipated slave. Traveling in their caravan were 6 of the 7 children that Matilda and Nathaniel had together, and then Matilda's 3 daughters that she had from a previous union. By 1857, all of their children were adults and had families of their own. Upon their arrival, Nathaniel Jackson bought 5,535 acres of riverfront property, known at the time as the El Capote Ranch, equipped with a licensed ferry landing. They established their community, engaged in subsistence farming, cattle ranching, and established their Methodist church. The church behind me is not the original church. The original chapel, established by Nathaniel Jackson as the first Protestant chapel in the region, was an adobe structure with a palm-thatched roof that unfortunately did not survive seasonal flooding of the Rio Grande. The Jackson Ranch Church dates back to 1874, when it was founded as the first Spanish-speaking Methodist church in the area. The bones for this particular structure date back to 1904 and has been renovated several times since. The front porch was built on to the front of this church in 1974. Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks's son, Martin Jackson, kept the church community active after Nathaniel's death in 1865. Serving as chief steward of the congregation, he donated the land where we are standing for the church and the family graveyard. This is Martin Jackson's headstone. He is buried here next to his 3rd wife, Espiridiona, and one of his sons, a few headstones to the right, Ben. According to family folklore, written reports, and oral history interviews, the Jackson family community was instrumental in shepherding runaway slaves across the Rio Grande to freedom in Mexico. The ferry landing on this property no longer exists, as the river has jumped several times since the 1850s due to storms and hurricanes. but the geodetic marker put here by the International Water and Boundary Commission indicates that the river was nearby. There were several members of the Jackson family who mustered into the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War. And you might be wondering why. Here at the Jackson Ranch graveyard is a military headstone dedicated to Abraham Rutledge. Abraham Rutledge was a white man who was in a family relationship with one of Matilda Hicks's daughters named Nancy Smith Jackson. Abraham and Nancy traveled with the Jackson caravan from Alabama here to the banks of the Rio Grande in 1857. Together, they had several children. Their oldest son, Manliss, mustered into this Confederate unit with his father in December of 1862. The unit was called Captain Thomas's Company of Partisan Rangers and consisted of several local Tejano ranchers. 2 Confederate colonels were also operating as slave catchers along the U.S.-Mexico border at that time: John Salmon Rip Ford and Santos Benavides. This Confederate partisan ranger unit was specifically looking for skilled horsemen to patrol the border during periods of heightened conflict along the Rio Grande. These ranchers were also landowners. Imagine that you were part of the Jackson family who traveled over 1,000 miles to find a peaceful place to live with your loved ones, far away from the ugliness of discrimination against your interracial family and far away from slaveholders. Imagine you arrived here on fertile land along the banks of a fluid international borderland where you could live and worship and build a family community. And 4 years later, the state of Texas seceded from the Union and declared allegiance to the Confederacy, a group that values the very mentality that you fled a few short years before. The Jacksons and their extended family members like the Rutledges, the Singletaries, and others were very concerned about the safety not only of themselves, but their loved ones, their property, and their possessions. If you look in the 1860 census for Hidalgo County, Texas, you will see many names of those who mustered into this Confederate unit listed as landowners. Members of these biracial families, such as Abraham Rutledge, Manliss Rutledge, Samuel Singletary, Eli Jackson, John Jackson, and Bryant Jackson, were either part African American, emancipated slaves, or married to one. With Confederate slave catchers operating in the region, it is no wonder why these people mustered into this unit. What better way for them to keep their fingers on the pulse of Confederate operations in the immediate area and be able to move their loved ones over the river to safety in Mexico when slave catchers were nearby? This unit of Captain Thomas's Company of Partisan Rangers was only active for 4 months between December of 1862 and March of 1863. Here we are at the Eli Jackson Historic Cemetery, about 500 feet down the road to the east of the Jackson Ranch Church. Eli Jackson was one of Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks' son, who served as Hidalgo County Commissioner appointed by the Texas governor in 1869, and was later elected by the people for the same position in 1890. He established the cemetery in 1865 when his father Nathaniel died. Nathaniel Jackson is buried in this section of the cemetery here in an unmarked grave. The Webber family settled on the northern banks of the Rio Grande, here in what we know today as Alamo and Donna, Texas. John Ferdinand Webber was a veteran of the War of 1812 and arrived as a single man in Austin's colony, approximately 315 miles north of here, and he arrived there in 1826. There, he acquired land that encompasses what we know today as Webberville, Texas. he met a neighbor slave named Silvia Hector and began a relationship with her that resulted in a child born in 1827. Webber honored that relationship and continued to have children with Silvia. But their children were considered enslaved property of Silvia's owner, John Cryer. Webber was finally able to procure Silvia's freedom and the freedom of their first 3 children, Elsie, Henry, and Leonard, in 1834. This just prior to Texas's independence from Mexico in 1836. Soon after, they were able to marry and continue to have more children while living on their land grant named Webber's Prairie on the banks of the Colorado River. At first, the local population was accepting of John and Silvia's union, but as more Southern planters arrived in Texas, and then the Fugitive Slave Act was re-enacted in 1850, the attitude towards these families turned ugly and uncomfortable. The Webber children were no longer allowed to attend school, so John and Silvia had to bring in a tutor to live with them to educate their children. It was here that John Ferdinand Webber purchased 8,856 acres of land, at the time known as the Agostero del Gato land grant, just prior to the establishment of Hidalgo County in 1852. John and Silvia had 9 children when they arrived, and then had 2 more children, Rachel and Jeremiah Marcelino. In 1858, Webber purchased a licensed ferry landing on his property and used it to trade goods with steamships traveling up and down the Rio Grande between Brownsville and Roma. According to research that my colleague, Maria Esther Hammock, has produced for the Texas State Historical Association, Silvia Hector had experience back in Webber's Prairie helping runaway slaves find pathways to freedom via the Colorado River. The Camino Real, an often beaten path between Nacogdoches in East Texas that ran through San Antonio, across the Rio Grande at Guerrero, and into Mexico ending in Monclova. This byway passed closely through Bastrop, which was near the Webber home in Travis County. This thoroughfare was also traversed by slave catchers, so Silvia had experience in finding alternate routes by which to travel. Upon arrival here in Hidalgo County, along the newly established natural and international border between the United States and Mexico, but according to the biographical sketch titled Rip Ford's Texas, Ford recollects that the Webber sons also ran interference with Confederate troops for the Union Army stationed in Brownsville. Members of the Webber family mustered into Captain Thomas's company of partisan rangers, a Confederate unit comprised of local ranchers. Samuel Singletary of the neighboring Jackson Ranch, grandson of former slave Matilda Hicks, and was married to Sabrina Webber, the daughter of John Ferdinand Webber and Silvia Hector, had mustered into this unit. Jasper Biddy, husband of Sarah Jane Webber, the first child of John and Silvia that was born free, also mustered in. Clearly, these 2 men were not sympathetic to the Confederate cause, with no interest in supporting slavery. They mustered into this Confederate unit in an effort of self and family preservation. In 1848, the Rio Grande became the natural and international border between the United States and Mexico at the end of the Mexican-American War. In 1852, Hidalgo County was founded, being carved out partially of western Cameron County and eastern Starr County. The Webbers arrived in this region just before the founding of Hidalgo County, approximately 10 miles to the west. John Webber purchased 2 leagues of land, 8,856 acres, and established his ranch here on the Rio Grande with easy access to water. Today, several descendants of the Jackson and Webber families still live in Hidalgo County, The knowledge that they have African American heritage in their ancestry was not always a welcome concept. As the years progressed and generations passed, family members embraced this knowledge. When the Jacksons and Webbers arrived in the 1850s, the social climate here was more accepting of people of color. There was space for these two family units to carve out a piece of the countryside to call their own. Less attention was paid to the color of one's skin, and more attention was paid to transnational cooperation, trade, and commerce. The Jacksons and the Webbers assimilated immediately into Tejano culture. John Ferdinand Webber became known as Juan Fernando. Spanish became their prevalent language, and as generations were born, Spanish became their first language, and they identified themselves as Mexican Americans. By the turn of the 20th century, less attention was paid to them as Negro colonies, and more attention to their participation as local elected officials and those holding prominent positions in the community. But their participation in what we refer to as Underground Railroad-like activity is what puts these families on the national and international map. What I hope happens as a result of this research is that our society as a whole begins to accept people who are different or other than themselves. For many in these families who had no previous idea that they were partially of African American descent, I hope that they embrace this truth and be more kind, compassionate, and accepting of others. We all could learn a lesson from this. We are already 20 years into the 21st century. It is time that we live and function in a more unified world, to embrace our own cultural heritages and be willing to learn and grow through the acceptance of others. I hope that the members of today's Jackson and Webber families discover and embrace their ancestors' role in the assistance of runaway slaves who traversed South Texas on their way to freedom in Mexico. I know that there are already many who have.